Hello, I'm Murray Lumpkin, and in this last module on the regulation of medical products, we're going to spend some time sharing thoughts on where regulation of medical products might be going in the 21st century and what some of the drivers for the evolution of medical products regulation might be. The learning objectives for this module are to really hope that you can develop a fundamental understanding of some of these factors that I believe and others believe will impact the evolution of medical product regulation as we get further into the 21st century. As you will remember from the module that we did just prior to this on the impact of globalization, I think we will continue to see globalization and the way that the agencies and the industry and the consumers are responding to globalization is going to continue to be one of the major drivers. So we'll spend a fair amount of time in this module talking further and in much more depth, not only about what the agencies and the industry have already done in response to globalization, but also some ideas about what further activities and further avenues they will be taking as we get further into the 21st century. I think we will begin to see further discussion on what we mean by harmonization and alignment, what we mean by collaboration and coordination, and what does this concept of reliance really mean for regulators and for industry as we get further into the current century. We mentioned a little bit previously about some of the regionalization activities that are going on in many parts of the world, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how this goal for regionalization and what that means, particularly as opposed to other harmonization initiatives. And then I think beyond the impact of globalization, there are going to be some other drivers that we want to spend a little bit of time on. For example, some of the new technologies that are on the horizon and some of the new methodologies for developing the databases to support those technologies and even some of the more conventional technologies with which we are already accustomed. And then finally, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the rise in many parts of the world on what is called health technology assessment and what that means for the more traditional market access regulation that we've been talking about and which has really been the fundamental gatekeeper for many of these products in the 20th century. And the question really is being asked, who is going to be the gatekeeper? What is going to be really the fundamental decision maker as far as the availability of products to patients in high-income countries and low-income countries? Will it continue to be the market access regulators, or will it begin to morph into the health technology regulators and people who are looking at other issues relative to these drugs, such as cost effectiveness and comparative effectiveness, when they're making decisions about whether to pay for, whether to buy, whether to make available certain products or not. So let's start again where we left off in the previous module, talking about the response to globalization and what we might see as the greater rise of collaboration and alignment and reliance as we get further into the 21st century. When you talk about regulatory cooperation, as we began in the last module, I hope you began to get the idea that sometimes this idea of regulatory cooperation means different things to different people. And they tend to use words to describe their impression of what it means. And often what these concepts mean are clearly quite complementary to each other. And I would postulate that it's really when you bring them all together, you get the idea of what regulatory cooperation as we get into the 21st century further is going to be like. There is the issue of harmonization and alignment, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that has meant in the past and what that might look like in the future. This whole idea of regionalization, and as opposed to harmonization that we'll talk about, what this means in terms of really a much more unified approach to regulation as opposed to a harmonized approach to regulation. And we'll talk a little bit about what the difference between those two might actually look like. And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the difference in recognition and the traditional approaches of either mutual or unilateral recognition, and what people are talking about now in terms of reliance, which, like recognition, could be either mutual or unilateral. And particularly, as we mentioned yesterday, how reliance might have a larger role to play in low and middle income countries, but it also has a very prominent role to play in high income countries, and how they're approaching regulation as we get further into the 21st century. Now, when we talk about regulatory cooperation, as we mentioned previously, this is not a theory that is yet to be realized. This is actually something that began in the latter part of the 20th century, as we mentioned earlier, fueled by globalization and the reality of the products that these individual regulators were overseeing in their jurisdiction no longer being just national products, but being global commodities that were at any given point in time either under or not under the control of a competent regulatory authority. But actually, while globalization was the impetus for regulatory cooperation in many respects, I would argue that actually it was the rise of many of the information technology tools that really became the foundation for and the tool through which regulatory cooperation was actually able to happen in the way it did. If you think of the world before the mid-1980s, the early 1990s, the tools that regulators had to actually communicate with each other were really the very traditional tools for communication that existed before the explosion in the IT community that we have now. But once we got to the point in the late 1980s, the early 1990s, where information now became globally available, this whole concept of cooperation changed and became much more a reality. With the rise of digitalization of most of the regulatory processes and documents, we went from a world where, for example, a new drug application in the pre-digital age might have been 700 to 800 volumes that were several inches thick, that actually had to be delivered to a regulator in the back of an 18-wheeler, to an application that was simply something that was transmitted instantaneously from a company through a designated portal into the computer database at a regulator. You can imagine when regulators were thinking about cooperating and trying to compare documents, when you were in the world of large paper documents versus digital documents, I think it becomes quite obvious why it was not until we got in the world of digitalization that really regulatory cooperation was able to grow and to begin to flourish as it has. Along the same lines, the rise of email clearly made it easy for regulators to communicate with each other, not only in real time, but also in time such that the time zone differences didn't make as much difference because you were able to communicate and pick up communications at different points in time, whereas previously the communications by telephone actually were dictated by the time zones and the differences in time zones that existed. So the rise in the IT tools that became available in the late 1990s to most of the high-income regulators really did provide the tool that was necessary to put together the regulatory cooperation efforts that were the efforts that the regulators were making in response to the realities of this new globalized world in which they found themselves. And I think you'll also see that over the last 25 years, the face of international collaboration has begun gradually to evolve and change from what it was in the early 1990s to what it is today, and clearly what it will be in decades to come. The slide you see here is one that I have borrowed from Emer Cook at the European Medicines Agency, and I think she, in this slide, really tries to group kind of the big eras in regulatory cooperation that have already occurred. If you look between 1990 and 2000, in that first decade of real regulatory cooperation as we know it today, the real focus at that point in time was through an organization called the International Conference on Harmonization that we'll talk about in a little more depth in a few minutes. But it was really an effort by the European Union, by the United States, and by Japan to try to harmonize, to try to align the technical requirements for a product in order to submit those particular data to the 3 different regions in the marketing applications that one had to submit to those 3 regions. Based on the successes of what occurred in that decade, then in the second decade, the emphasis was not so much away from the harmonization of technical requirements, but in addition to that, looking at this idea of convergence, collaboration, and most importantly, the rise of new players other than just the European Union and Japan and the United States. Players such as China, players such as India, players such as Brazil, and others who were now becoming sources of manufacturing for many of the products that were now these global commodities about which we have been talking. And then I think in the last 5 years, you're beginning to see in the high-income countries and in many of the middle and lower-income countries, this move not only from convergence and harmonization on standards to figuring out how do we really leverage the resources that we have in work-sharing kind of arrangements, in multilateral cooperation as opposed to just bilateral cooperation, and really forming coalitions such that the work products that one trusted agency produces can be relied on by another agency, where resources can be combined, where redundancy in regulatory undertakings is minimized. And this you will begin to see is a far cry from where we were back in the early 1990s when this whole issue of talking to each other as regulators and trying to harmonize technical requirements began at that point in time. Now, I wanted to spend a little time talking about this concept of harmonization because it obviously is a term that is thrown around quite freely, and it's a term that I think over the years has come to mean different things to different people. I always, when I see the word harmonization, I always think first on the issue that despite 25 years of talking about harmonization, we've never been able to harmonize on how we spell harmonization. And that particular element, I think, is just so characteristic of some of the challenges you have when you're talking about harmonization and alignment, when you're not talking about agreement on scientific principles, but you're talking about cultural norms that people are used to using, that people within their own community find very, very helpful. And that it's often these cultural norms that are the hardest to harmonize, such as I say, how you spell the word harmonize. But I think the more important concept here is that in many people's mind, they think of harmonization as really unification, or an effort to unify, to make exactly the same whatever it is you're trying to harmonize. And I think it's important for people to remember that in many aspects of this discussion about harmonization, harmonization does not mean homogenization. Another way to look at this that some people have talked about is to kind of use a musical metaphor. You know, when people sing in harmony, they're not singing the same notes, but they're singing notes that actually work very well together to make a coordinated, beautiful, efficient sound. It's a way so that you don't have cacophony in music and in sound. But it's different when you sing in harmony and when you sing in unison. When you sing in unison, obviously everybody is singing exactly the same note. And when you're singing in harmony, people are singing different notes, but in a way that work together in a very pleasing way. So I think it's a nice metaphor that some people use to try to differentiate between efforts that lead to harmonization and efforts that lead to unification. And I think when we start talking about regionalization and efforts as we get further into the 21st century of regionalization, you're really beginning to get more to unification. Because like in the European experience of unifying their centralized procedure for the member states of the European Union, you come out with one opinion, with one label, with one decision that's applicable to all the countries. There's no harmony there. That's unification. That's a unity approach. And in many of the regionalization efforts, this is the idea and this is the goal. Where often when you're talking about harmonization, you're really looking at ways of getting people as closely aligned as possible to get rid of as much of the cacophony in regulation as you can, and to try to come forward with agreements that make for a situation that is much more efficient as a way of developing products and regulating products than everybody off doing their own uncoordinated thing. One of the other ideas that often came up in the early discussions about harmonization and what the goal of harmonization was this idea, I think, that many, particularly in industry, had, that the ultimate goal of harmonization was this holy grail of one application and one approval worldwide. And many people who have looked at what's happened in harmonization over the past 25 years, if they thought that was the ultimate goal, clearly they're going to express disappointment in that that is not what has happened. But I think many people, myself included, would argue that that was never the goal, and perhaps that's not a realistic goal and not even a goal that industry would want. For example, if you say a given agency has the right to make a decision and that that one decision will be valid for the world, that also means if that agency says no, then the answer no is valid for the world. And I think many people who have looked at this as the Holy Grail, they like the idea when the answer is yes. They don't so much like the answer being no, when that means the entire process for that product is cut off around the world. And I think realistically we have found out that oftentimes, and we'll talk about some of the reasons in a few minutes, it makes perfectly good scientific sense for different regulators, based on the same scientific database and the same understanding of what that database is telling them, to come out with different regulatory decisions. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen often enough that when you look at why this happens, you find that there are some very good public health reasons that a regulator might make a different decision based on the same database because of contingencies that are very real within their own jurisdiction. So I think when we think of harmonization, when we talk about harmonization, people are not talking about an ultimate goal of having this holy grail where there is one application and one decision that is valid for the world, but really more focusing on the pieces of the life cycle, the clinical trials piece, the review and authorization piece, and the post-authorization piece, looking at different perspectives and different pieces of those and figuring out how can we best align the technical requirements such that the amount of patients that have to be exposed, the cost that's involved, the questions that have to be answered to come up with a valid scientific assessment of the product are indeed as harmonized as possible to, again, really create the most efficient and scientifically valid process for gathering the data you need to understand in your community how best to use a product. So when we talk about harmonization, I would submit that there has been a tremendous amount of progress through ICH and others on harmonizing and aligning the technical requirements for the development of products and for the submission and post-authorization oversight. There's also been a tremendous amount of progress on the content and the format. When you think that now there is what is called a common technical document that has been agreed by most of the high-income countries around the world and is used by many other countries around the world as basically what the application looks like and what the pieces of the application are, and that most of the pieces of the application can be used around the world within local requirements added to the top or added to the bottom of the application as needed. And this is a far cry from where we were in the 1980s and early 1990s when you were talking about different applications, different formats, different requirements in most of the countries of the world, and even a reality where companies, when they were developing their products, had to figure out, what is my US strategy? What is my British strategy? What is my German strategy? What is my Australian strategy? And there was not this concept of a global strategy that would meet the needs in a much more harmonized, aligned way of most of the markets into which they wished to go with that product. But as I was mentioning a few minutes ago, what has not been harmonized and what probably will not be unified in many different aspects is the decision making. And I think it'd be interesting to look at why the decision making might not be harmonized as much as perhaps these other technical requirements and the content and format. I think when you look at that question, clearly in the world of science, there is not always harmonization. There's not always agreement as to what a particular set of scientific data is telling us. Oftentimes there is, and I don't think, particularly when we look at the differences or those situations in which there is a difference between a decision made by regulator A and a decision made by regulator B, it's generally not that there was a difference of opinion as to what the science was telling us. Actually, it's other disciplines that clearly play a role in the overall regulation of products. The laws are different in different parts of the world. They are not harmonized. Medical practice is not harmonized around the world. The liability for companies and the liability for regulators is not the same around the world. The promotion regulations and what a company can do and say about its product and how it markets it and how it gets its messages out are clearly very different in different parts of the world. The marketing niches that companies choose for a product might be different in the medical situation that exists in country A versus kind of how they want to try to niche their product given the medical situation and the need in company B. The way products are paid for, the reimbursement policies, the reimbursement decision makers in countries are quite different. And when you look at all of these various factors that play into kind of how you actually continue to make sure that a product is used in as safe and as effective a manner as possible, you can begin to see why, even if you're agreed on what the science says, how that then is determined, how the use is then determined in the various countries brings a host of other factors in that I've just mentioned that are far from being harmonized and much less harmonized than even the approach from the scientific side and the content and format side that we've been talking about. I also think that one of the real important things for people to remember is that when regulation of products occurs, there is a tremendous amount that the clinical trials and that the science tells us. We design trials, we execute trials, we gather the data and analyze the trials in ways that allow us to know as best as we can what that product will actually do in a given population and what the potential toxicities of that product are when it's used in that test population in a certain way. We are able from that to extract and to extrapolate how we think those data are telling us that the product will actually perform when it's used in a much larger population that is much more heterogeneous than the population that was used to test the drug. But what the clinical trials don't tell us is within a given community, when you look at the benefits based on the clinical trials and you look at the risks based on the clinical trials, are you as a community willing to accept that benefit-risk profile? This is not the science of regulation, this is the art of regulation. The clinical trials do not tell us what the risk tolerance profile is within a given community. That often is a product of what the alternative products are in that community, what the disease state is in that community, what the disease is actually doing in that community as far as it being a disease that is causing a tremendous amount of morbidity and mortality, or is it more of a nuisance disease in a given community as opposed to another? I mean, these are all factors that regulators in a given jurisdiction who are responsible for a given community have to try to tease out from a variety of sources as trying to figure out within our community, are we willing to tolerate this benefit-risk profile that we learn from the clinical trials? And it's not surprising that in different communities with all of the different variables we were talking about, sometimes the decision is, you know, our community is not willing to tolerate this benefit-risk profile for the following reasons. Whereas the decision in another community might be, given what we have going on here and given what our current choices are, we are willing to accept this same benefit-risk profile that our neighbors in another community are not willing to accept. So there are a host of reasons that when people talk about harmonization and they have this idea of this holy grail of one application and one decision, it's just not a practical, realistic goal for harmonization. And what I'm hoping you will take from this is an understanding of what harmonization to this point in time has tried to accomplish and kind of how, based on that foundation, we're now going to morph into what harmonization, what unification, what things mean as we get further into the 21st century. If we think about harmonization and what was pushing this to start with, again, going back to the early 1990s, and quite realistically, when you talk about the history of ICH, the real push for harmonization came initially from the industry because they were clearly the first to realize the change that was happening in their industry and the impact that globalization was just beginning to have, and they knew what their product pipelines were going to be. They knew much more what the impact of globalization was going to be, and because of this, they were able to bring the regulators from the United States and Japan and Europe together to begin to have this discussion about how are we going to make this process of developing drugs and authorizing drugs much more aligned and much more harmonized as we went into this brave new world of globalization. I think once we got into it and people began to see the benefits of the crosstalk, the sharing of ideas, the learning of how others do, the regulatory authorities as we've talked about in some of the earlier modules, began to realize that there were some very good things in them for this. As they continued to get pressure from various components within their communities, as they continued to be compared to each other by their parliaments, by their constituents, by patients and manufacturers, they became quite interested in learning more about what the other were doing, trying to figure out how they could learn best practices from each other. And it became an effort that not only was focused really on the harmonization of the technical requirements, but it was the tool through which the relationships at an organizational level and the relationships that were so very important at a personal level began to be developed, that created an atmosphere of trust and understanding that it didn't exist previously, because there really was no relationship. It was not so much a relationship of distrust or misunderstanding. It was simply, as we talked about earlier, a world in which people were focused on their own jurisdictions and primarily on the manufacturers and the products that were made in and distributed within their own jurisdiction. And I think clearly then the most important constituent in this discussion, what was in it for patients and practitioners, was again the realization, particularly when we were talking about serious and life-threatening illnesses, a lot of the new technologies that were being developed, a lot of the new approaches to medicine and to treatment of diseases that didn't really fit into the traditional drugs, biologics, devices, silos that had existed earlier in the 20th century and that were reflected in the laws that had been developed in the early and mid-20th century. People began to realize that there needed to be a much more aligned and an evolving process that would, in an efficient but yet a very scientifically robust and valid way, incorporate the desire for getting access to good products as quickly as possible, but not giving up the requirement that products that do not meet the standards are not allowed onto the market. In the United States, this change from looking only at what happens within your own jurisdiction to being part of a larger global enterprise actually got reflected in the law that governs the activities of the Food and Drug Administration in the late 1990s, when you look at what Congress did to the mission statement that is written into that law. As you can see in this slide, the first and the second pillar of the mission statement that Congress gave to the FDA are the traditional mission statements that FDA has really had from its founding through most of the 20th century, and that is to promote public health by doing certain things and overseeing the life cycle of these products, and then also to protect public health by ensuring that foods are safe and veterinary and human drugs are safe and effective, that devices have reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. These are the general principles and the general pillars of mission that the FDA has always had. But in the mid-1990s, Congress added this third pillar to the mission, saying that now, given the realities of what was happening, it was also the mission of FDA to participate through appropriate processes with representatives of other countries to reduce the burden of regulation, to harmonize regulatory requirements, and to achieve appropriate reciprocal arrangements. So we see here Congress in its role as the voice of the American people and as the institution which creates the laws under which our government has to operate, was giving FDA the permission to become part of the larger global regulatory enterprise, to interface and to cooperate with counterparts around the world for the public good that is also and has been from the beginning the mission of the US FDA.